Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the TIPS Forum for the 2021 edition. We've got over 74 people in the room. We've got attendees from a range of different government departments, from the region, from academia, and colleagues as well from a range of different places. So welcome to everyone. We are going to start now. Just in the chat, you're welcome to introduce yourself in the group chat so that you're able to see who's around the table and in the conversation. We will be opening up for opportunities for people to talk and to engage along the way. It's part of the dynamics of the forum. We also would like to just let you know that our keynote speaker unfortunately bailed on us, and we struggled to find a replacement at the last minute. So we will have to adjust our program slightly, but hopefully we still have a robust and good opening session. Okay, so when you introduce yourself, if you can make sure that you've got all attendees as well, so that the other attendees can see who's in the room. Thanks. So when you select that for the introductions in the chat, we also have the Q&A function. And if you have any questions you'd like to post on the Q&A, please do so. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Saul Levin. I'm the Executive Director of TIPS, and I'm going to be doing some introductory remarks this morning. Colleagues, Professor Tregenna, our co-host, welcome to the TIPS Forum 2021. At the start of 2021, when we were doing the initial planning for our forum this year, we had grand plans of an in-person event. Unfortunately, a much more contagious Delta variant, the third wave, along with the slower than expected rollout of the vaccine, has meant that we are again holding our forum electronically. We piloted it this time last year, and it was a successful event, and so we felt it was we should continue in this format. We do miss the physical in-person forum, and hopefully we will be able to get there next year. We've seen this impact of COVID having taken a huge toll on our economic and social life. And we believe the theme of this forum this year is therefore extremely relevant. As an organization, TIPS, we've had to adjust our approach, how we work, and as such, the forum is different from our old in-person forums. We've moved away from having the parallel sessions, which we usually do, and we will also be running the forum over 2 mornings rather than the day and a half, as we've had in the past. One of the impacts is that we have slightly less papers in this format than we usually do. I think we normally would have had double the number of papers. And we are very cognizant of risks of Zoom fatigue. So we are keeping the session slightly shorter, and we've asked our presenters to stay within the allocated time, so that we, of course, have the time for debate and inputs from colleagues. Part of the benefits of the TIPS Forum is the robust debate from the people in the room, and not just the presentations that we receive. So we're looking forward to having engagement and for people to contribute their own insights on a set of very important topics. Hopefully we will be able to have our in-person event again next year. Things are looking like they're progressing well with the vaccine rollout and booster shots being developed. And hopefully by that point, this time next year, we are able to have an event and see each other again. The TIPS Forum for me has been one of the highlights of the year. I've always enjoyed connecting with colleagues, hearing the interesting papers, and in particular, the lively discussion. TIPS turns 25 this year, and over the past 25 years since we were established, we've held the forum 18 times. There were 1 or 2 years that we missed, and we hosted other events in those years. And we've seen the TIPS Forum as being an important space to share ideas, to grow our thinking on different aspects of economic development. And for me, the purpose of the forum has not changed over the years and remains an important space to have policy relevant research presented and debated. This year, as we celebrate our 25th anniversary of TIPS, we'll be launching a publication that reflects on the work that we have done, and we'll hold a dialogue event when we do that launch, as well as several other events. And hopefully, at some point in the next 12 months, we'll be able to have an in-person celebration to celebrate this important milestone. We will send out invitations when it's safe to do so. As an organization, we hope that we continue to add value and contribute to deepening our understanding on a range of economic development issues. And importantly, to strengthen our understanding of industrial policy, it's increasingly clear to us that industrial policy is dynamic. It's not a static concept. And as we evolve, as our economy changes, so we need to continually update our thinking and our approach to how we take forward industrial policy with different, very different constraints as we saw when industrial policy was first developed. We're also increasingly exploring areas such as the just transition and technological change. And in the past few years, TIPS has also solidified our quarterly bulletins, our trackers, and our value chain research. We've seen the benefit of having consistent and regular research outputs that provide a base of understanding of what's happening in the economy and also in the regional economies, so that we have a good understanding of a range of different dynamics in the region. So it's important that we continue to do that, and we continue to support the required policy engagements that are taking place. And in the face of many adversities, it is becoming an increasingly complex and difficult space. There have been some points over the past 25 years where the future of TIPS has not been certain. And it's good for me to reflect on that, but also to say that we're very fortunate that we've had solid partners, including in government, particularly the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, who've supported our research efforts and allowed us to flourish and grow. And there's been a range of partners. It's across government. We've had some very important support that we've received from DPME, the presidency, as well as colleagues in GTAC and Treasury, Science and Innovation, and other departments, DPE, for example. So we've continued to work with a range of economic departments. We've also increasingly been working again with donors. TIPS has its foundations in working with the IDRC as the Canadian Research Institute that supported us in our early days. But over the last few years, we've increasingly seen support coming from the EU, from the UK government, and a range of others for us to take forward some of our very important research that we're doing, particularly on the just transition and understanding the impacts of that. We've also had a very enthusiastic and supportive board of directors and a members group. We have a TIPS members group who have guided us and ensured that TIPS remains relevant and engaged in some of the core economic policy issues. One of the core problems that we have looked at, and we did extensive work on last year as we saw the economic fallout from COVID-19. The pandemic, on top of pre-existing challenges that confronting the economy, has set us back several years, not to mention the recent social upheaval in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng. As we look at how to take our reconstruction efforts forward, we need to ask ourselves why South Africa remains with persistent poverty and inequality. A few weeks before lockdown last year, we hosted a professor from the UK, which was his first visit to South Africa, and we had a morning of inputs, and he was very impressed. And at the lunch break, he asked us, he said, from all I've heard this morning, the country has so much going for it. I don't understand why it can't achieve higher growth rates and address its economic problems. It was difficult to answer that question briefly, but there are lots of issues that we do need to think about. And having now experienced the economic disruption over the past year and a half, it's opportune that we reflect on that question more seriously. And as we take forward our economic reconstruction efforts, it's important that we consider what the strengths of our economy are, what the weaknesses are, not only in our economy, but in our society as well, and understand what we are going to be doing in order to respond to those challenges. When we think about the Great Depression of the 1930s and also the post-World War II economic dislocation, both of those major events saw the emergence, on the one hand, Keynesianism, and on the other, we saw the emergence of industrial policy as we now understand it. As response measures to rebuild the economy and society were implemented through those various different approaches. Both have been used successfully since, yet despite that, and the need that we see in South Africa, and of course some policies in that direction, we haven't taken either as our guiding policy since 1994. It's there, for me, if there ever was a time to be more forthright in our approach to economic development, it's now. The various approaches are being implemented to improve the business environment and stave off the worst of poverty. And we'll hear more about those measures, including what's being done with various grant and support measures. Operation Vulindlela, as we've heard from other fora, has taken forward some very important and significant measures. These responses have created jobs, they've saved lives, and they do provide a long-term approach. But given the extent of our unemployment, our poverty, our inequality, which have now been exacerbated by COVID-19, more robust measures are clearly needed. We've settled at an equilibrium of low employment levels and low growth. We've not been able to break from that trap. And with each shock over the past 3 decades, we slip further and further away from our goal of full employment, decent employment, and a society that has good economic growth and development. For South Africa, then, a V-shaped recovery, as we have seen elsewhere, is not enough. We need to go further to address the economic recession that we experienced even before COVID-19. Yet, as it stands, we are looking at a K-shaped recovery, which will then see us further exacerbate our existing poverty and inequality. These are complex issues to respond to, especially in the context of changing technologies. There is a need to reduce our carbon emissions to net zero CO2, the destruction wrought by climate change and a global health pandemic that's changed the nature of key industries. For example, we're unlikely to see travel and tourism, which were strong industries for us in the past, becoming robust again for many years to come. And this is amongst other headwinds that we face. Importantly, as we confront our own challenges, we should not be neglecting the important role that the country has in the region. Indeed, we've had several previous tips forums unpacking regional value chains and economic development of the region, and it is part of our discussions over the next 2 days. There's a lot more that I could say on each of the topics, but I'll leave that to the papers and to the presentations over the next 2 days. We'll be exploring how we understand these issues and the measures required in response. And we will hopefully have robust discussions and that these will make an important contribution to the thinking in this space. And that the research efforts of all those who've been working on these papers and presenting their papers, sharing the insights, will add value and move us towards improved policy making and, of course, supporting the reconstruction efforts. The themes for the panel discussions this year are session 1, which will start at 10 o'clock today, is Rethinking Inclusive Industrialisation, Recovery and Reconstruction. Session 2 is COVID-19 and Lessons for a Just Transition. Session 3, Advancing Regional Trade and Recovery for Post-COVID-19 Recovery. Session 4, Macroeconomic Policy, Industrial Policy and Social Protection, Responses to COVID-19. And then we'll close the conference with the TIPS chairperson, Dr. Tebogo Makube, who will go immediately after session 4. I'm sure you've heard as you've come in that we're going to be recording each of these sessions. The sessions will then be uploaded onto the TIPS website, and as usual, we'll be uploading PowerPoints and papers onto the TIPS website and the TIPS forum website. I would like to then acknowledge all those who made this conference possible. It takes a huge effort to hold events such as this, and the electronic format doesn't make it any easier. And it's a strong team that has enabled this event to take place. Our internal TIPS team, in particular Baba, who's successfully coordinated the conference this year with the support of Roselle, Daphne and Lesego, who have worked extremely hard to make sure that we're having this event. Thank you. Our partners in DTRC, as well as the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development at UJ. And these partners are critical, not only in the support that they give us, but also the wealth of knowledge that they provide to this organizing this event. We've also had a steering committee who've contributed to ensuring a highly relevant and strong program. Having a virtual forum means that we have been able to reach a broader audience that we're not able to, who have not always been able to attend an in-person event. And again, we have a range of participants from across the world. So welcome to our South African TIPS forum, and we hope the discussions are valuable for you and provide some useful insights into what's happening in the Southern African region, but also into some of the core challenges that we're facing. As I mentioned earlier, we have a mix of government officials, academics, researchers, participants from state-owned enterprises and international organizations, not to mention industry associations and private sector participants who've joined us. While we miss the social interaction and networking that we usually have at the forum, I'm really excited by who's been able to join us today. I'm looking forward to an exciting forum and hope that you'll be able to join us for the full conference. It's an opportunity to engage with key issues that are confronting us, debate with colleagues, and share our ideas and knowledge. I hope you enjoy the forum and actively participate in the discussions. Just before I conclude, I'd like to ask participants to have a short moment just to reflect on colleagues, friends, family members who passed away during this COVID-19 period. We've lost many good people over the past year and a half. So if we can just reflect on that for a few moments. Thanks very much. I now hand over to Professor Fiona Tregenna to say a few words of introduction as co-host, and after which we'll start the first session at 10 o'clock. I thank you very much. Over to you, Fiona.
Thanks, Saul. I'm really delighted to say a few words at the opening of this year's TIPS Annual Forum, and to again be partnering in the forum as South African Research Chair in Industrial Development. Let me first congratulate TIPS on its 25th anniversary. TIPS has been a feature of the economic policy landscape in South Africa for all these years, particularly in trade and industrial policy and in related areas. And I think there's really been a strong impact in policy-oriented research which is highly relevant to, and that influences policy. Beyond the research, TIPS has also been made an impact in terms of training and capacity building. And just a personal recollection, I remember being a beneficiary of this. I think it must have been about 1997, 98, even though I'm dating myself, attending a TIPS organized training course, and along with Rashad Kasim, who was at that stage the director of TIPS, but also attended the training course. Vusi Gumede, who's had an illustrious career in government and academia, and is now the dean at the University of Mpumalanga, Donald Onyango and others, and we kind of kept in touch in the years since then. I also remember attending TIPS annual forums in the late 90s, as Saul was saying. These forums have been going on consistently for many years now. And at that time, I was in the trade union movement, not in academia. And there was great value to me personally of having the opportunity to engage with policy relevant research during the TIPS forum. And looking at the participants here today, I see people like Nikki Cataneo that I remember listening to in those early years of the TIPS forum in the 90s. And it's great to see the consistency of people up until now. So congratulations to TIPS and best wishes for the next 25 years. As a South African Research Chair in Industrial Development, we're very pleased to again be partnering in this important event. Let me just say a few brief words about SARChI Industrial Development. This is one of South Africa's national research chairs. And in our case, the focus is on structural change, industrial development and industrial policy, innovation and technological change, and related topics. And the three key pillars of the work program are firstly research, secondly public and policy engagement, and thirdly capacity building. Examples of events that we've held over the last month, in addition to the ongoing research and policy work and training and so on. The week before last, we partnered with the Young Scholars Initiative to host the first Young Scholars Conference on industrial development and structural change in Africa, which was really a fantastic event. We had 39 papers being presented from scholars from around the continent and beyond on different aspects of structural change and industrial development in Africa. I see some of the colleagues here today were also part of that event, and I'm sure there'll be mutual interest in years to come. We've also just wrapped up on Thursday an 8-week event, a research sprint on digital sovereignty in Africa, as well as hosting or co-hosting various webinars, book launches, and so on. I also just want to take this opportunity to do a shout out about our book on structural transformation in South Africa, Challenges of Inclusive Industrial Development in a Middle Income Country, edited by Antonio Andreoni, Pamela Mondliwa, Simon Roberts, and myself, which is coming out probably later this month with Oxford University Press. And I see some of the colleagues who are presenting this morning, like Justin Bonds and Laura Kaziboni, were authors of chapters in the book, and watch the space for book launch in the next month or two. The theme of this year's forum is very topical and will remain relevant for some time to come, because I think even as we're getting the pandemic itself under control, obviously the economic rebuilding and reconstruction process will take much longer, as well as addressing the crisis before the crisis. I think the pandemic has really underscored, if this was even needed, that it cannot be business as usual. And it gives us the opportunity and the necessity of revisiting the policy trajectory and the growth path, because clearly it's unsustainable on so many levels. I just want to reflect briefly on the theme and what some of the implications might be of the pandemic as it pertains to industrialization and industrial policy. I think that the pandemic has drawn attention to the importance of productive capacity in manufacturing, and we saw this particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, and the dire needs for personal protective equipment, and more recently for vaccines and so on, and that countries cannot just rely on importing. It's really important, no matter how sophisticated one's economy might be, for countries to have their own productive capacity in manufacturing, and capacity that is also agile and can be easily adapted. So this links to the importance of technological upgrading. I think the pandemic has in some ways accelerated some technological changes, of course very unevenly, towards digitalization and so on, and both the dangers of being left behind, and the opportunities of deploying technologies strategically as part of the industrialization path. I think the pandemic has also drawn attention to the importance of industrial policy, and of state capabilities. We can see that countries that have strong pre-existing state capabilities, including industrial policy, have been better placed to use those state capabilities to better handle the pandemic, both in terms of the public health aspects and the economic aspects. And these kinds of state capabilities are not something that can just be developed overnight in the face of a crisis. They're capabilities which are built up incrementally over time, and that have proved important, whether it be in the trace testing of the early stages, or in designing and implementing appropriate economic support measures. I think we find a kind of core set of state capabilities that are important and that can be deployed, whether it be in industrial policy or in other areas. And these state capabilities are also built up through practice. So it's by doing, and including by failing and learning from those failures, that states are able to hone those capabilities and to be better equipped to react in the faces of a crisis such as the one we've experienced over the last year and a half. The pandemic has also brought changes in the international organization of manufacturing production, changes in value chains, and I'm not sure, it doesn't look like South African firms have been generally able to take advantage of some of those changes to upgrade in value chains. But I think there's been more fluidity in the international organization of manufacturing production than was previously the case. It's also drawn attention to the importance of industrial development that's responsive to the meeting of basic needs. So industrial development that has some link with what is actually needed for socioeconomic development, and in this case, responsiveness to the pandemic. Part of the building back better, I think, from the pandemic is around green industrialization and the green transition more broadly. And obviously there's ongoing debates around how to tie the support for economic reconstruction, rebuilding and so on internationally to the green transition. And I see that there are some papers that are engaging with this very topic. Lastly, I think at a policy level, the pandemic has also drawn attention to the need for policy coordination, both within and between countries. So within countries, it's obviously nothing new, but I think a crisis such as this, again, just highlights the need for better coordination of particular interest here between industrial policy, health policy, macroeconomic policy, and so on, and then internationally of multilateralism, which has been sorely lacking. So there are very relevant topics in the papers being presented in this forum, which I think engage in different ways with some of the issues which I've alluded to, as well as more broadly, including issues of local content, the role of SMMEs, COVID and the climate crisis. See a couple of papers on various aspects of trade in relation to COVID, and macro industrial policy and social protection responses to COVID. So I think even though it's a short program, but there's a really fantastic set of papers lined up. Let me just add my thanks to Saul's for appreciation to all of the organizers, in particular the members of the steering committee, and the various organizers from the TIPS side, Baba, Daphne, Rosal, who worked so hard on getting the forum together. The various partners, DTRC, and from SARChI side, let me in particular mention Zhicheng, Alexis, and Koketso for their role. So I'm looking forward to the discussions over the next 2 mornings, and hopefully next year we'll be able to meet in person. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. Welcome back. Am I audible to everyone? All right, thanks. Thanks for the opening statements, Saul and Fiona. As they've mentioned, it's been 25 years that TIPS has been around, and we greatly enjoy engaging with colleagues from all over the world. And thank you for joining us this morning, wherever you might be. We can jump right into the next session. I'm Mbofholowo Tsedu. I'm a senior researcher and economist here at TIPS. Been doing research for quite a while as well, and very much looking forward to the discussions today. Session 1 today is around rethinking inclusive industrialization, reconstruction, and recovery. We've got 3 very nice papers lined up for you. I'll give you quick introductions now. But yeah, definitely, if there are any pressing questions, just make sure you post them in the chat. We'll do the question and answer session after we've taken all the presentations. Let me just open up the bios here for our presenters. All right, so the first paper looks at local content requirements. Ms. Lauralyn Kaziboni will be taking us through that. She's a consultant at DNA Economics, specializing in trade and regional integration. That will be followed by a discussion on assisting the automotive sector by Professor Justin Barnes and Mbongeni Ndlovu, who are with B&M Analysts. Gajeni, welcome back. It's very good to have you guys in the session as well. So that will be quite interesting, as automotives is one of our critical employers and key export industry as well. Then the final paper will be by Masibulele Zonyana, who is the head of public employment and skills development at the city of Cape Town. So yeah, I think it will be a good discussion, a mixture of local content, sector development, and the role of public employment in ensuring, industrialization and the development of the country. So with that short introductions, please, there are much fuller bios available online. I think the link was posted, and it has the contact details for all the presenters as well. So please feel free to get in contact with them if there are more questions, or to keep the discussion going post this. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it in terms of decorum. Yeah, let's take all 3 presentations, and then we'll take all questions after all the presenters have gone through. Lauralyn, are you ready?
Hey, Mbofi, yes, I am.
Right, go ahead. I'm sure you've been enabled with screen sharing capabilities. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Please, presenters, let's try stick to 15 minutes, and that will give us at least a significant time to have discussions afterwards, yeah? Lauralyn, go ahead.
Awesome, thanks, Mbofi. Can you just confirm that you can see my screen? And that's the one without the notes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for making time to present, to listen to our presentation this morning. But Matthew and I put this paper together, and it's largely based on a report that was funded by the EU South African Partners for Growth program. And it's important, that we just highlight the fact that the views that are expressed in this paper are Matthew's and in no way reflect the official opinion of the EU. So jumping right into it, so South Africa has adopted localization policies since the early 1990s with programs such as, the National Industrial Participation Program and the Defense Program. And often, localization policies have been adopted to develop the manufacturing sector. And now in the context of the COVID pandemic and building back better, the country has adopted the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, which prioritizes localization as a key component for reindustrialization. Yet, there are few and sparse research studies in South Africa that have really been undertaken to interrogate the pros and cons of localization policies, especially in the longer term. And as such, the objective of this study is to fill this information gap and highlight some of the outcomes from localization policies with a specific focus on the triple PFA and the REAP program. So this right here is just a brief overview of, what we're going to be presenting today. And it's important to just highlight that, these findings will be based on interviews with 14 EU businesses. And while we acknowledge that, it's a relatively small sample, I think it's important to draw some of these lessons. And we've obviously cross-referenced with a lot of literature in this area that have been undertaken to interrogate these issues. So just looking at, an overview of, South African localization landscape, this table essentially provides a summary of the policies, legislation, and programs. And obviously, this is not exhaustive. But in the case of South Africa, it's important to note that these policies have largely incentivized firms to set up production and facilities in order to access government procurement as a way of boosting domestic production, creating jobs, facilitating skills and technology transfer, among other objectives. And I mean, it's obviously important, that, we dive deep into all of these, but Matthew and I could only focus on two. So we focus on the triple PFA and the REAP program, given, that they are relatively comparable. When unpacking, localization policies, it's always important to keep at the back of our minds these 4 dimensions that we have here. So market size and reliability really speaks to the extent to which there's steady demand, which is also very stable over time. The policy design and coherence, which speaks to the clarity and the transparency of the rules and regulations, as well as the design of complementary policies, particularly industrial policies related to special economic zones, trade and competition policy, among others. And then thirdly, the restrictiveness, which is the level at which the minimum local content is set when these localization policies are designed. And then lastly, the industrial base, which speaks to the available domestic expertise and capacity that is available or can be developed over time to meet the ramping up of localization policies. And then now turning to the 2 policies that we, focusing on this morning, and starting with the triple PFA, we know that, the legislation allows the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition in consultation with National Treasury to designate sectors and products. The policy was last revised in 2017 to align with the triple BE codes of good practice, and is currently being revised as part of, developing the single regulatory framework under the draft public procurement bill. And I mean, it's important to note that the triple PFA does make some leeway in terms of meeting local content requirements through the exemption process. So under special circumstances, firms can apply for an exemption with the DTIC and obviously can meet lower local content requirements. And it's also important to highlight that the verification of local content is not mandatory unless it's required and asked for by the procuring agent, which often, is a government agency. And we can see in this table here that, over time, the DTIC has designated close to, 100 products, as we can see here. And over time, there is a tendency, to increase local content for sectors that have already been designated through incorporating local manufacturing processes such as fabrication or forging, or even requiring, the procurement of domestic inputs such as steel and plastic. But if we look at the REAP program, it's different from the triple PFA, and it applies, a slightly different approach. The REAP program was exempted from the triple PFA scoring system. So the triple PFA looks at, your 90-10 or 80-20 rule, whereas the REAP program looks at a 70-30, where 70% is for price and 30% is for economic development. And local content requirements sits within, the economic development criteria. And as you can see here, the economic development criteria includes 7 components, with local content equivalent to about 25%, which is an effective 8% of, the total project cost. And unlike, the triple PFA, the REAP program local content requirement is perceived as more flexible because it's calculated as the project, as a proportion of the project value, where products and services are sourced locally. And for the REAP program, the localization requirements differ by technology and have been ramping up over time. So we see that for solar PV, it started off at 35% in bid 1, and it's expected to reach a minimum of, it reached a minimum of 45% in bid window 4, with an expectation that, with bid window 5, it'll be much higher. And additionally, looking at bid window 4, we realize that various components have been localized by technology. And for solar PV, there is quite a significant overlap with, the sectors or the products that have been designated under the triple PFA. So that would speak to your solar PV products such as mounting frames, inverters, transformers, and so on. And what does this all mean? So in talking to, the firms and obviously corroborating with a lot of existing other research, we realized that localization policy has attracted significant investment in South Africa. For example, with the REAP program, where the EU accounts for just over 50% of the foreign direct investment, that amounts to about $42 billion since the beginning of the program. And, the investments by OEMs have attracted, importantly, complementary investment along the value chain. So for instance, you find that parts and component manufacturers or crane operators, paint manufacturers have set up shop in South Africa to meet the increasing need from the initial investment. Moreover, these foreign firms have exposed local industries to advanced manufacturing and other highly technical manufacturing processes, which really provide fertile ground for skills and technology transfer within the country. One company, in the shipbuilding industry, for instance, noted that their local engineers work very closely with the European counterparts in designing and, engineering parts that are suitable for South Africa. And I mean, such flow of information is crucial for developing local capabilities and really contributes to the domestic innovation system. And then lastly, EU investors are leveraging their presence in South Africa as a gateway into the continent. And in doing so, this really increases South African exports, which in turn increases production. And I mean, in labor-intensive sectors, this definitely creates jobs. However, these gains from localization have been marred by about 4, key factors, which can be linked back to some of the 4 dimensions that I mentioned earlier. So government's demand for designated products has been quite unsteady and erratic over the last few years. Firms have highlighted, some issues with unclear processes and procedures. To some extent, policies have been identified as being restrictive and do not really reflect the domestic industrial base. And then lastly, there have been limited complementary policies. If we look at the triple PFA, for instance, there has been decline in public infrastructure investment in the last few years, which really is an ongoing concern. And then there have been, sectors that have been designated which naturally have very unsteady demand. So for instance, if you look at the firefighting vehicle, which is designated at about 30%. For this, vehicle, demand is very infrequent, and it's very challenging to be able to source some of, the components such as aluminium components that we know are not sourced locally. Therefore, this puts the manufacturers in a very precarious condition and are unable to meet that local content requirement. And looking at the reprogram, the delays in issuing bid window 5 has been particularly challenging. And we know that between 2013 and 2015, a lot of foreign investors ramped up domestic manufacturing capabilities in the country, as well as even domestic firms, which were set up in order to serve the wind and solar markets. But because of the delays, we see that some of these capabilities have been eroded. And this really questions the ability of firms to meet the local content for upcoming auctions. And if I can just draw your attention to one of the companies, DCD Wind Towers, which was established in the Kucha Industrial Development Zone. In addition, to receiving tax incentives because of IDZ, the company also received, capital injection from the IDC in 2016. And up until the company closed down in 2019, the IDC was also covering, the company's wage bill. And despite DCD Wind Towers having first mover advantage in, manufacturing steel towers, and receiving financial support from government, the delays in signing of power purchase agreements and the bid window 5 resulted in the company closing down. And this, led to a loss of jobs of, at least 100 jobs being lost. But if we look at, the cost implication of some of these localization stories, and I'll start with the triple PFA, then I'll move on to the reprogram. So if we look at the triple PFA, they are really 2 success and not so successful 3 stories. Firms that, did manage to lower production costs did so thanks to, long-term investments linked to government's requirements around the competitive supply development program, which really requires firms to develop domestic suppliers. The other firm benefited from import protection, which made imported goods relatively more expensive and attractive to assemble and manufacture locally. And this really illustrates how complementary policies can creatively support localization. For the other 3 firms, the increase in domestic production was in part explained by the requirements to source high-cost local inputs such as steel and plastic. For instance, one of the company manufactures PVC pipes to supply the municipalities, and it sources its raw material from Sasol. And we all know, there have been a lot of court cases around Sasol's excessive pricing. And just looking at this table, what is quite alarming are some of the pricing responses. So while 2 of the companies can absorb the cost differential, there is a tendency to pass on, the increase in production costs to the buyer, and in, most cases, that's government. And then looking at the reprogram, the cost implications here are a little bit more dire. With the exception of 1 company, all the companies recorded an increase in production costs. And then talking, to the firms at the OEM level, the main challenge there is that there are few domestic manufacturing companies that can meet the local content requirements. And because of that, this limits price competition and the OEM's bargaining power, which can result in abnormal pricing for, solar inverters or wind towers, whatever it may be. One company noted that, the price difference can be nearly 40% between local and imported equipment. For tier 1 suppliers, of parts and components, the cost implications obviously depend on the technology, whether it's solar or wind. And, given the fact that South Africa has limited capabilities for manufacturing solar equipment, several companies, have attempted to invest in this area, but were unsuccessful because, of import competition from Asian manufacturers. And again, sorry, I'm almost done, just couple more minutes. And again, these costs are passed down the value chain. And I mean, there is a study that was done by Etemaya and Lloyd at NMMU, and they also found that, local content regulations can increase costs for renewable energy by about 10%. And then just lastly, there are, 5, recommendations that we thought were worth noting. So firstly, it's important, that, government draws on evidence in order to, arrive at policies that can generate benefits in the long term. So undertaking, detailed cost benefit analysis or feasibility studies before expanding or extending localization policies is important. And then secondly, limiting designations to products where there is strong and stable government demand. And then thirdly, a regional approach to government procurement, because in talking to the companies, some of the firms will, move from Botswana, for instance, into South Africa in order to meet, with the local content requirements, and that can be problematic in the context of expanding regional value chains and growing the region as a whole. And then the interaction between local content regulations and other policies definitely deserves further exploration to see, where there is tension, how to relieve it, and where there are policies that can complement and strengthen each other, how to cement that. And then lastly, just open and constructive dialogue between the public and private sector is really needed in the design and implementation of local content requirements. And that's it. We really look forward to hearing your thoughts and opinions on this presentation.
Thanks, Lauralyn. Smack dab on time. Please just check the chat box and the Q&A. There are some questions there that you might want to respond to now, but obviously we'll also note them for the Q&A session at the end of the presentations, but thank you for that. Justin, Kajen, is that you? I see. Will you be leading us?
Mbongeni will be doing our presentation. Thanks very much.
Kajen, the floor is yours.
Mbofhi, thank you for that introduction, and good morning, colleagues. Okay, thank you. So I'll be taking you through, colleagues, a paper that we did for this conference. It's based on work we did for NAMSA last year. It's titled Evaluation of Appropriate Stimulus Measures to Support the Recovery of the South African Automotive Industry. I did this work with my colleague, Professor Justin Barnes. We both represent a consulting firm called B&M Analysts based in Durban, but we also work as academics in an institution called the Toyota Vessels Institute for Manufacturing Studies, which teaches manufacturing-focused MBAs. So specifically on this particular work, we were asked by NAMSA to look at or evaluate particular options to stimulate the auto industry. For those who don't have a context on the auto industry, it's one of the most significant manufacturing subsectors in the economy. It contributes about 4.9% to GDP. 60% of that is from manufacturing, and 40% of that is retail. It also supports about 110,000 jobs in the economy, 30,000 focused in manufacturing, and about 80,000 in retail. The reason why we wanted to focus on the demand side is we noted that there are certain supply side measures, such as the TERS support and loan support to industry that was being generally offered within South Africa's stimulus plan. But from our understanding of the automotive industry, and also a review of what were the effective stimulus measures that were implemented in the 2008 and 2009 global financial crisis, we understand that based on the type of industry that the automotive industry is, it relies on a steady demand for new vehicles in particular. And so the kind of deferral or suppression of demand has quite a severe impact on the automotive industry, and often the most effective support measures are actually on the demand side. So what we did for this particular study is we did three types of analysis. The first was a global review. We did a desktop review of stimulus measures that were being implemented by some of the top automotive industries automotive economies rather in the world. South Africa is the 22nd largest as of 2019. So we looked at the top 21, and this was done between the 31st of July and the 21st of August last year. We then also did a small survey of domestic OEMs and distributors. In particular, we looked at 14 light vehicle manufacturers. So light vehicle stands for passenger cars to bakkies. And then we also surveyed 10 medium and heavy commercial vehicles. And the medium and heavy commercial vehicle category basically is buses and trucks. And we asked them on their preferred stimulus options. And then lastly, we itemized a specific set of options, and we modeled those options in a vehicle demand model, basically using 12 years of SA retail data to understand what would be the fiscal impacts of doing that, and ultimately the demand response that would be obtained from those interventions. To take you through some of the findings from the global review, out of the 21 countries that we reviewed, we found that 6 of those countries were offering some form of specific automotive demand stimulus measures. As you can see in the table presented, it's a mixture of new programs as well as extending or adjusting of existing programs. I'll take you through the findings by country and region. So firstly, in terms of what we found in China, we found that one of their primary interventions that they implemented was an extension of a subsidy program for new energy vehicles. So new energy vehicles is the standard terminology that we're using to cover these green or new types of propelled energy from the internal combustion engine to new energy propulsion systems such as electric, hydrogen fuel cells and hybrids of those. So there was a program of subsidizing these particular vehicles that was supposed to end in 2020. And as a result of COVID-19, China extended that to 2022. These subsidies rather are worth around $3,500 per vehicle. And in some instances, local governments are also providing additional subsidies for NEVs. One example is the Guangzhou region, where the local government is offering NEV buyers an additional $1,500 towards their purchase of these vehicles. And this was a limited incentive from March 2020 to 31 December 2020. China is also giving some limited subsidies to ICE vehicles. So that ranges from around $141 to $2,880 per vehicle, subject to specific restrictions, which vary from one location to the other. One specific intervention that they made in China was also increasing the vehicle registration quotas, basically the licensing quotas for each region, in order to allow more people to purchase new vehicles. And then lastly, China also actually decreased the VAT on pre-owned vehicles from 2% to 0.5%. And this VAT reduction is going to remain in place until 2023. The next 3 countries, Germany, Spain, and France, basically are from the EU. So as part of the sort of the Green Deal that the EU currently has in place, there are a number of countries that already have programs in place to subsidize the purchase of electric vehicles. However, Germany and France in particular actually adjusted their policies to stimulate more demand for these particular electric vehicles. So Germany's subsidies were based on a threshold of price of vehicle, which is 40,000 euros. So, for example, if the vehicle is less than 40,000 euros, you can get a subsidy of around 9,000 euros. And this varied also if the vehicle was higher than that price. And they also reduced the ownership and company car taxes for these particular new energy vehicles. Whereas in France, consumers receive a subsidy of around 7,000 euros for BEVs. And if the price is less than 45,000 euros, and a reduced subsidy for BEVs up to a maximum of 60,000 euros if the price is higher than 45,000. So the difference being that in France, the program was focusing on the price of the vehicle, whereas in Germany, sorry, both were on the price of the vehicle, but at different thresholds. So with Germany at 40,000, whereas at in France it was 45,000 euros. We also see that within the EU countries, there's government fleet upgrading programs. So Spain and Germany introduced government fleet upgrading programs. The Spanish government allocated about 100 million euros to upgrade its official government vehicle fleet, whereas in Germany they budgeted around 200 million euros for a fleet exchange program aimed at substituting of vehicles for electric mobility for tradespeople. The third type of approach within the EU countries was scrappage schemes. The idea of a scrappage scheme is basically that you focus on older vehicles and basically subsidize the scrappage of those vehicles in favor of new vehicles. What we saw is that in Spain and France, they introduced specific scrappage schemes to stimulate demand. In Spain, the scrappage scheme was around vehicles that are older than 10 years. And in France, basically focused on consumers, and they focused whether they have a net taxable income of less than 18,000 euros were entitled a scrappage scheme, and those eligible consumers were entitled to about 3,000 euros subsidy for the scrapping of old polluting vehicles for new ICE vehicles. Russia also had a scrappage scheme specifically focused on older vehicles, and Indonesia was the one sort of exception in terms of policies. They focused more on financing options. So two financing options in particular. The one was a loan deferral scheme. Basically, you could buy a vehicle and the interest and principal amount was deferred for a period of 3 months. And then the other one was a down payment reduction program, which reduced the down payment that you need to pay from 25% to 10%. The challenge being here, though, that it doesn't seem from the data that that was able to actually stimulate a large amount. So in summary, our findings from global review were that national governments it's clear that the support is primarily driven by national governments, although in some instances there's support from subnational government to provide the support. And there are three main types of vehicles, vehicle support mechanisms that come from global competitors. The first is targeted subsidies. And as you can see, a lot of that is targeting this class of new energy vehicles. The second is tax reductions, although this does have a fiscal impact in its approach. And then the third is finance support, although that was limited to Indonesia. And as we said, we weren't able to find significant evidence of that being strong support. The second type of analysis we did was to then survey domestic OEMs and distributors. We gave light vehicle companies 6 stimulus options to choose from, whereas we gave medium and heavy commercial vehicles only 5 options. They were asked to rank their options as to which they believe to be most effective at aiding the recovery of the vehicle market. A rank of 1 represented an option believed to be the most effective, whereas 5 or 6 represented the least effective. The summary of the results you can see on the table there. Basically, among light vehicle manufacturers, the most preferred option was tax reduction. Local OEMs, if we isolated local OEMs, so local producing companies, they had a much stronger preference for tax reduction, whereas importers and dealerships had a stronger preference for vehicle support mechanisms. On the medium and heavy commercial vehicle side, basically the most preferred option was vehicle purchase subsidy, followed by the provision of vehicle finance and then a tax reduction. The local OEMs had a slightly weaker preference for a subsidy, but a stronger preference for vehicle support. One specific identified proposal that was also attractive to us was around the handling of VAT within lease agreements. Basically, the way that VAT is measured creates a situation where people actually pay interest on VAT on lease agreements. So the idea was to capitalize the VAT payments, specifically for light vehicles. So that was one option that wasn't given in the survey, but came out as quite appealing as well in support. So then the third thing that we did is we then said, well, based on the global review and based on the domestic survey, can we actually test what the impacts would be of these support measures in the context of South Africa? And what we did is, you can see on the right-hand side here, we used a model that we had developed for previous NAAMSA work. We basically used 12 years of data from 2007 to 2018, and we modeled the demand and established the price elasticities for vehicles. The idea of a price elasticity is basically the sensitivity of demand as a result of price changes. So just to give you the context, the average elasticity of demand for vehicles across the market is negative 1.16, which is sort of highly inelastic. And it basically means that holding everything else constant, an increase of 1% in the price of new vehicles is associated with a 1.16% decrease in the demand for new vehicles. Interestingly enough, the highest or the most significant price elasticity is actually in quintile 2, which is vehicles between 214,000 vehicles to 303,000 Rand cost of vehicles. And the elasticity there is around negative 1.96, 1.95, which is quite high. And then from quintile 3 to quintile 5, the elasticities tend to decline. So then what we did is we modeled 5 particular options. The first was a fiscal neutral adjustment to the ad valorem. The ad valorem is a specific kind of tax that's put on motor vehicles because they're considered a luxury good. and it basically hasn't been changed for many years. So the idea was to increase the threshold in order to make basically cars cheaper at the bottom end. The second was a removal of the CO2 emissions tax. This came out also from some of the interviews that we had, that basically there's a sense that this tax is a regressive tax, and it's not actually having a strong impact on the environmental outcomes because of our, for example, our poor fuel quality. Because we have such poor fuel quality emissions, we're not able to get better quality environmental outcomes anyway, you know, despite the CO2 tax. The third was a combination of the above two, just a control experiment. The fourth was a removal of VAT completely. And then the fifth was a fiscal neutral reduction in VAT, basically moving it from 15% to 13% specifically for the automotive vehicle industry. For the sake of time, I just want to focus on additional vehicle demand and the impact of the stimulus. And I start on the right-hand side to give you the results. The fiscal neutral VAT option was quite attractive because there's quite a significant vehicle demand of around 20,000 vehicles, although there was a slightly negative outcome for the fiscus of 163 million. But it still seems like an attractive option. The control experiments, as we suspected, were both seen as unfeasible because of the significant impact on the fiscus. So I won't go through those. But then the two that were also deemed to be quite feasible was the removal of CO2 tax. So we see that a removal of the CO2 tax gives you an additional vehicle demand of around 12,000 units. But it's also actually giving you a positive impact on the fiscus of just below a million, just below a billion rand of additional fiscal revenues. So that's a positive number. So it actually proved that this tax is quite a regressive tax because a reduction of the tax actually results in an increase of revenue for the fiscus. Similarly, although less pronounced, fiscal neutral ad valorem, the modeling there suggested that it would increase demand for vehicles by around 17,000 units, and there would be a positive impact on the fiscus of around 164,000 rand. On the medium and heavy commercial vehicle side, we couldn't model the options there in a fiscally neutral manner. But however, we did note that the two current programs that were ongoing, the loan guarantee scheme and the SME fund, both have potential of basically focusing on stimulating the automotive industry on the medium and heavy commercial side. If they are specifically focused on transport operators in that category, and also both programs could be adjusted to support purchases of modern fuel efficient medium and heavy commercial vehicles. So in summary, our conclusions and recommendations from this, we basically suggested four proposals. The first are the removal of the CO2 tax. Based on our modeling, the net fiscal position would improve by just below a billion rand, with the industry benefiting from an additional 12,000 units of sales. The second is a reduction in the ad valorem rates. And based on our modeling there, there's net fiscal position would remain basically unchanged, with the industry benefiting from 17,000 units. The third is the removal of upfront payment or capitalization of VAT for private lease agreements. And then the fourth is set aside for transport operators within the existing COVID loan guarantee scheme and SME fund for vehicle purchases to stimulate medium and heavy commercial vehicle refleeting. So I'll leave it there. There may be a few things that I haven't covered that we can chat about during the question and answer. Thank you, Mbophi.
Thanks, Mbongeni. Without much wastage of time, Masibulele, you're up. Mbongeni, can you stop sharing? Thanks.
Morning. Thank you for the opportunity. Masibulele Zonyana is my name. I work for the city of Cape Town and currently a student at the Mandela School. The presentation and paper is basically a result of an improved version of 2 papers that are submitted to the school. And I'm so grateful for the assistance from both the city and the school. Essentially what the argument we're making in the paper is that the way in which the EPWP in the city of Cape Town is implemented actually serves as one of the key tools that can be used to respond to the current challenges that are facing SMMEs, challenges that have been emphasized or amplified by COVID-19, particularly for the lower end of SMMEs, and that is micro and the very small enterprises. As a background, we understand that SMMEs are very much noted to be playing a very important role throughout the African continent when it comes to their impact on the economy. This is the same for South Africa. Although South Africa is not doing as good as it might be thought, because it's a relatively powerful and industrialized country, the contribution of SMMEs to the economy are not as great. And their contribution as well towards employment creation are a bit of a concern when compared to other countries on the continent. Again, the research is basically exploring 4 questions. The first one being trying to understand the core challenges facing SMMEs in South Africa and Cape Town. The second being trying to identify at an anecdotal level support programs available to SMMEs in South Africa, and whether it's successful and why. The third question deals with giving a brief understanding of the nature of the EPWP within the city of Cape Town. And the last question tries to really answer the question of whether we can really position that the way the city of Cape Town is implementing EPWP as a tool to respond to the challenges facing SMMEs, again, more particularly the lower end of the SMMEs. Essentially, we have 3 main arguments that we are making in the paper. The first one is that since the advent of democracy, literature shows that SMMEs in South Africa continue to face the same type of core challenges. And these challenges revolve around the lack of skills across the board, whether it's business management, networking, finance readiness, or actual access to finance, business support and infrastructure. The second argument we're making relates to a point that Professor Tregenna made about institutional capacity or historic capacity. And we find that in the literature as well, South Africa has a very strong institutional capacity of a specific nature that it inherited from the pre-democratic history. And we are saying that this institutional capacity or policy framework capacity actually plays a role in leading or contributing to the country creating SMME support programs that mainly benefit the upper end of SMMEs, that is your small and micro, medium SMMEs, at the neglect of the lower end. And unfortunately, the lower end is still noted as well to be actually the end that contributes a lot of the jobs that are required, particularly again, when you look at the other countries on the continent, you find that the lower end in South Africa does not respond as much as it should. The fourth argument we're making is that when looking at how the EPWP in the city of Cape Town has been positioned, again, using this institutional and policy capacity of the city, we find that it has been well positioned, even though the city itself has not started to exploit this position when it comes to supporting SMMEs. The fifth and foundational argument we're making is that across the board, looking at available information, there is really a lack of an appropriately structured and well-coordinated approach to supporting SMMEs. Again, mainly the lower band of SMMEs, micro and very small enterprises. And so in an attempt to really find SMME programs that support that are coming out of South Africa, we really find at the center the Small Enterprise Development Agency, SEDA, who is noted to be the national coordinator for SMME support. And when you look at SEDA, you find that SEDA has an enterprise development program that can be categorized into three broad categories. And the first category deals with programs that support SMMEs that have passed the startup phase, and another one deals with SMMEs of different varieties. But the more interesting one for us is the one that seems to be more structured and a bit more patient. What we mean by this is that it supports SMMEs for a period of between 10 to 15 months, and it's very specific in its criteria, and it looks at specific industries or sectors like manufacturing, agro-processing, ICT, and these are sectors that are still said to be quite critical for South Africa's growth and job creation, which is more important for the EPWP. However, we find a challenge around this more structured program by SEDA, because it's in its criteria. We find that the criteria for the number of people required versus the criteria of turnover are really not speaking to each other. And this means that such programs are likely to contribute a lot towards what has been said to be jobless growth in South Africa, because they seem to be focusing on more on turnover rather than the number of people employed by the participants or the SMMEs that get to benefit from such programs. But however, we must note that overall, SEDA can be said to have ambitious programs attempting to deal with all of the core challenges facing SMMEs, and is correct perhaps in focusing on the upper end of SMMEs, because this is a vibrant end of SMMEs that has proven itself to be able to create some jobs and be sustainable. However, this focus has not actually resulted in much sustainability and growth for SMMEs across the board. As SMMEs do not actually do better on the continent. And then when you look at what's going on in the private sector, one of the most interesting programs available comes from the South African Chartered Institute Enterprise Development and SMME program, which mainly focus on giving financial skills, ensuring that SMMEs of the lower end are finance ready. The results coming out from this program seem to be very good, because a lot of the private sector companies are starting to engage SARChI on how SARChI can come and add value into these private sector organizations, ED, CSI programs. However, one of the key challenges around this is that if there's a possibility that such programs might not have the impact that is required by the country if government does not get involved and direct in terms of what it means to add value for these organizations and these programs. As we understand that we get a very critical warning from academics like Mazukatu, who say that we must discuss in the policy space and in government what value really means. And for us, value would mean that support programs that ultimately lead towards sustainability and job creation for South Africa. And also, Mazukatu also warns us that for a challenge of this nature, we really need an entrepreneurial state And that means a government or a state that's willing to take the necessary risk, because the private sector is not going to take those risks. The private sector usually waits for someone to take the risk and then enters at a point where they can make profit. And then when looking at Cape Town, trying to understand the state of SMMEs in the city, we find that since its development or consolidation back in 2000, 2001, Cape Town has had a very specific road or evolution in terms of its support to SMMEs. By 2003, Cape Town actually developed a policy for supporting businesses, and this policy actually notes the importance and the challenges facing the lower end of SMMEs, noting that they are the most challenged. This was back in 2003. And then throughout the years when the city developed its first IDP, it then took the decision back between 2006 and 2011 to actually try and find best practices internationally, and that best practice was found in the city of Barcelona in an initiative called Barcelona Activa. Engagements led to the city signing an agreement, knowledge and technical transfers between the city of Barcelona and Cape Town, and this actually led to the creation of what became Cape Town Activa. And the results of Cape Town Activa really was getting the city of Cape Town knowledge around what is now called an SMME ecosystem. This system basically was said to be very challenged by the Global Competitiveness Report of 2011. It was said to be actually fragmented and fraught with duplications. And this led the city to actually try and fine-tune its position by using what it then called the Economic Growth Strategy of 2013, which was informed by the GCR report, where the Economic Growth Strategy then took the decision to say, from the Cape Town Activa, we must now create what became the business hub, focusing on easing red tape for SMMEs and an information desk that will allow SMMEs and entrepreneurs the opportunity to easily get access to information that will lead them towards using what the economy, the SMME ecosystem better, as it was fraught with duplication and fragmentation. And so this system that the Business Hub uses, and that information desk uses a tracking system called the BQTRC, which is a business query tracking system. And one of the amazing things that have been found by the city's reports around this system over the past 5 years or so is that the SMMEs that engage the city still show that the sector itself in the city is facing the same challenges that are found across the country, challenges of lack of finance, lack of skills, lack of understanding what's available. And essentially the city's data is saying the demand and supply do not match. The demand for the services and the supply for the services do not match. In fact, if the demand for the services actually understood the supply would crash. We would actually have something similar to load shedding, because the city's reports are saying that there isn't adequate supply of the type of services required by SMMEs within the city. And unfortunately or paradoxically, we find that there's a lot of excitement coming out for this, the city's SMME space that notes that the city is actually becoming more reliant on the high-tech industries, which is a bit of a challenge because in the city, only 20% of the residents have grade 12. This means that these high-tech industries are likely to create high-skilled jobs that will not be matched by the population of the city up until something happens. And this will then result in more inequality, more challenges, more potential protest, and more dependence on EPWP. As we can see from this table is that while the city's economy is growing, increasingly reliant on these high-tech industries, the majority of the SMMEs in the city are actually not found in these high-tech industries. They're found in industries that support, for instance, tourism, finance, business support, trade and accommodation, which is tourism is one of the biggest sectors within the city of Cape Town. And so this raises a question of what of the EPWP, what can the EPWP do? For a lack of, because of time, I'll just browse through this before we get into the state of the EPWP or the nature of the EPWP in the city. We must now understand the actual nature of the EPWP in the country as a whole. EPWP, as we know it in the country, actually dates back to 2004. But even before that, a version of the EPWP and Community Works Program was actually implemented in the 90s. But essentially, from the national government's EPWP business plan, the current one, we see that SMME development, skills development, were actually part of the key objectives of the program, even though they were abandoned as they were found to be too ambitious for the program. And we also see that the program itself has not really maintained its or achieved its targets from phase 2 up until now. But research comes out to say that actually the EPWP has had a very important impact on the social side of our system in the country. And so it's still important. But in Cape Town, we see a slightly different aspect and nature of the EPWP, because from day one, it appears that the EPWP was actually well positioned within these policy and state capacities structures at a strategic level. We find that the EPWP from the economic growth strategy was well positioned and it's actually overachieved. And then we find that in the current IDP period, the city has actually strategically positioned the EPWP to be one of the key tools used to achieve what the city calls economic inclusion. And it links EPWP to the department that's responsible already for the support for SMEs and businesses. But this relationship has not well been exploited currently, but strategically and in terms of documents, EPWP is already well positioned to deal with this thing. So the corporate EPWP office, in response to the current IDP, developed an internal 5-year strategy. And in this strategy, they speak about what they call the quality of a work opportunity, which really means skilling on accredited training that respond to the growth sectors of the city and ensuring that there are longer duration opportunities. And these longer duration opportunities has resulted in the city focusing on opportunities that range between 12 to 36 months, which means the EPWP of the city has the patience that the overall space within the SME sector does not have, because you can get some participants on 36 months training programs. And as a result, you can see that across the past 10 years or so, at least 7 years between 2010 and the current IDP period, the city's overall EPWP has actually been achieving its targets, while national government at national level has not really been achieving the targets. And then as a result of this strength, the city's EPWP office developed what they call a public employment and skills development framework, which guides the city on how it can actually go about developing skills programs under its public employment programs. And this is what that office understands as economic inclusion for the city's EPWP. 3 legs, still employment creation, education, skills and training, more importantly, entrepreneurship. And it does this with a sole purpose of understanding a strength that lies in the lower end, again, of SMMEs, micro, very small. And so as a result, in fact, not as a result, we find that there are already examples within the EPWP space in the city found in a department called environmental management, where since 2011, they've had what they call a mentorship program that has actually resulted in big contractors or service providers creating SMMEs, enterprises from EPWP workers, lower skilled people becoming SMMEs that are sustainable outside the program. And this is an example of 3 of these enterprises that were interviewed back in 2017, who actually showed that in the time that they've participated in a program, these were the results. We are more interested in the number of workers that they were able to employ, which is a very big jump as a result of participating in the EPWP program. We would understand that these are participants that were EPWP workers themselves in the program and then were scaled into becoming SMMEs or enterprises. And what's more important for us is the fact that when they were interviewed back then, they actually noted how they were able to source work outside the EPW themselves, how they were able to sustain themselves outside the program. And so in a nutshell, we then recommend that because the city has already data that tells it in the business tracking, query tracking system, what SMMEs and entrepreneurs need in the city, because the city already has an EPWP program that is funded by the city's rates system, because EPWP in the city is funded by rates, which means it actually has a sustainable funding model besides the grants that it gets from national government. Because of that, because of the public employment and skills development framework of the city and the strategy that says you are able to create 3-year projects and programs, and you focus on skills development when you implement such 3-year programs or projects, we are already in a position where we can create actually projects that focus on upskilling entrepreneurs who have already been communicating with the city for all these years through that business query tracking system. We're able to target those entrepreneurs, we're able to pull together accredited training around the finance needs, around business management, and we're able to sustain them for a period of 3 years because the city's EPWP is able to inject funding into its participants. At a national level, we are concluding and recommending that perhaps an improvement on the SMME support within the EPWP, focusing on strength, is required. A study of the positioning of the EPWP within the city of Cape Town, from that state capacity down to its ability to create programs. And then perhaps the grant that is given to cities like Cape Town come with conditions that say, actually, we require you to support SMMEs and show us proof that we are able to support SMMEs because we understand that your capacity is not well exploited at this moment in time, but it has the potential. Thank you.
Thanks, Masibulele. All right, colleagues, that brings to an end the presentations we have in this session. I guess there are some questions in the Q&A. I'll just get the ball rolling with overriding question for all the presenters around, how your topics contribute to inclusive reindustrialization in South Africa. I think for Lauralyn, these issues around local content, I think there was a question in the chat as well about whether the price is not acceptable or the cost of localization is not acceptable or not. And I think I would like you to touch on some of the design issues that you raised around the local content regulations. Dr. Makube, who leads the procurement office at the DTI, is in the session, so he might have some comments on the designation process, but as far as I know, it's a well-researched, thoroughly discussed process before the final recommendations are made. And some of the BE issues, I think the Triple BE Commission, there are equivalence programs, so it's not all about ownership. So there are ways to actually meet some of these requirements without them being onerous, but you might want to respond to that. On the automotives one, I think quite a good positive indication of potential increases in demand. I think the proposal on the ad valorem reduction, probably some of the DTI people might want to question that a bit. I see a lot of comments around scrapping of the carbon tax. I think that's quite a controversial one, given the climate change imperative. But yeah, I think you will comment on that. But I particularly liked the inclusion of public transport operators as well. And then on the public employment one, I'd be curious just on the scaling effect. How do we reach that scale, particularly on the exit strategies, as you mentioned, so that public employment transitions into entrepreneurship. So those are just some opening shots. The floor is yours. If you can also just respond to some of the questions in the chat. I see Mahandra here. He had a question on how do we encourage local content production, procurement from non-government entities, so beyond leveraging on public procurement. There was a question on whether the lowest cost should be what we're aiming for from David. That's regarding the local content requirements. Some of the questions have been answered in the chat, but go ahead. Who wants to go first? Lauralyn?
Hey, Mbofholowo, cool. Happy to kick this off. So just starting, with the fact that, obviously because local content policies are trying to ramp up production and increase capacity, therefore there's a tendency that there will be higher prices. A lot of, the international literature does point, to the fact that in the short term, there should be an acceptable price increase. And a good case study of this is America's Buy America program for the rail rolling stock industry, where they say that, costs are acceptable up to a cap of 25%. And such a cap would be important if, there are very clear benefits, that can be identified in the longer term. And at the moment, South Africa's localization policy doesn't identify a cap to this effect. So there you see a lot of, the costs being passed through, in the form of higher costs to the end user. And I think, there was a question around whether, firms are taking advantage of any loopholes, and that is the case. There are some firms that end up overpricing or inflating the price of the domestic, value addition to ensure that it's higher than the important local content, and in doing so, meet the local content regulations. And that's obviously, something that you don't want. Ideally, localization should be able to develop domestic capabilities and ensure that in the longer term, whichever industry has been designated is able to compete internationally. And I think this really dovetails nicely with what, one of David's questions around are supply side measures important? And the answer is yes. Demand side measures should be accompanied by corresponding supply side measures that deal with, skill development, lean manufacturing, and helping firms meet international standards and technological advancements. So yeah, that is quite important. And then just turning to, the localization policy and, the processes and procedures within the DTIC. There were very mixed feelings about it. And, some of the firms obviously said, when you engage with the DTIC, they're very forthcoming. Information sharing goes both ways. And if you need to apply for an exemption, it's a very straightforward process. But unfortunately, some of the firms that were here before localization policies were introduced did mention that, we just woke up one morning and our sector had been designated and they were not included in the process. So it's important, to ensure that, the stakeholder process is as exhaustive as possible to ensure that, the key firms that are manufacturing locally are included in the process. And then looking at the exemption process. So it's fairly straightforward. The notes that are published by the National Treasury are very clear about the circumstances under which exemption can be granted. But here, I think even, in the previous research looking at the rail rolling stock industry, there is this need to improve transparency. So a major concern has been that, exemptions have been granted on a case-by-case basis. and it's only applicable to the firm that applies for the exemption, and it's not publicized. So I think going forward, I'm not entirely sure what the DTIC's position is on this. It would be important, to ensure that, whenever firms are granted exemption, that, it's publicly available information, and the circumstances under which the exemption have been granted are also publicized. And in doing so, this ensures fair competition. And on the DTI side, that reduces any administrative costs or misinformation that may end up happening. I'll pause there for now, and then we can continue.
Thanks, Lauralyn. Justin, thank you so much. You've been answering quite a few of the questions in the chat, but I'll open up the floor to you and Mbongeni for any other comments.
Thanks. Justin, would you like to start? There have been a few questions around the CO tax removal.
Thanks, Mbongeni.
Environmental questions, yeah.
I think I'll leave Mbongeni to answer some of the questions, but maybe just in response to the carbon tax removal recommendation. This is not an attack on the need for a green transition, and it's certainly not a recommendation that we should continue with the high level of carbon footprint of the South African automotive industry, which is completely unsustainable. The industry is facing some severe headwinds, particularly with regards to the EU's carbon border tax and our ability to supply ICE-based vehicles into our major market, which is the European Union, as they transition rapidly towards new energy vehicles. So there is a clear need for a green transition in the automotive industry. The challenge with the carbon tax is that it's been added on top of a battery of other taxes that are essentially crippling the demand for vehicles in the South African market. The South African Automotive Master Plan indicates that the industry, to contribute meaningfully to the industrialization of the economy, needs to grow to 1.4 million vehicles of production at 60% local content by 2035. That would create another 120,000 jobs in the South African economy and add billions of rands to the fiscus. The reality when we model the population that is able to afford motor cars in South Africa, i.e. people earning more than $10,000 per annum, so adults earning more than $10,000 per annum, it would appear as if South Africa is it's reaching very close to peak consumption. Our recent work shows that there's very limited likely growth in the domestic market because we've lost so much of our middle class and there are so few people dropping into the basket of the population who earns more than essentially 150,000 Rand a year. So we have a real challenge. This is a scale-intensive industry with a strong export footprint. But that export footprint is tied to the earning of duty rebates for supply into a domestic market that, when we develop the master plan, would need to basically grow to 1.2 million units in order to sustain the 1.4 million vehicles of production. And yet it looks like we will have about 680,000 units of demand by 2035. One of the key reasons for the lack of demand in the South African market, as we've discovered from the modeling of the 12 years of dealership data, is that vehicles in South Africa are overtaxed. Overtaxed, not in the sense of sort of a moral judgment, but overtaxed in the sense of damage to the creation of value for the South African economy. Vehicle production is being negatively affected, and government fiscal health is being negatively affected. So it's quite clear that the aggregation of these taxes is resulting in the government taking less tax from the industry than it should, primarily because the taxes are misaligned with the price elasticities in the South African market and the underlying health of the South African market. So it's not so much a tax on the carbon tax. We were just looking at each of the taxes, and we modeled the taxes to essentially see whether it was possible to grow the industry while having no impact on the fiscus. And you'll see from that important table that Mbongeni presented that there were two taxes that are clearly having a negative impact on both the fiscus and the health of the industry, and through that negative impact, undermining value creation and undermining jobs. And that is the excessive ad valorem taxation, and the other is the carbon tax. Now, there's some good questions that have been posed around the externalities, and we completely agree with you. The question that we would pose back is, if we move away from economic arguments and we look at the empirical evidence, there's no empirical evidence that the carbon tax has greened the industry in any way or form, because there is almost zero demand for even soft hybrids, never mind plug-in hybrids or BEVs in the South African market. And a big reason for that relates to the overtaxation of vehicles, with probably the biggest culprit actually being the ad valorem, which the government has not adjusted in terms of the base formula. It's adjusted the severity of the tax, but it's never adjusted the formula, which essentially makes cheap cars in South Africa expensive, and it makes expensive cars very expensive. And of course, new energy vehicles of any kind, because battery packs are expensive, are by definition either expensive or very expensive, which means they fall into that sweet spot of very, very high taxation. So the carbon tax just makes it a whole lot worse, and therefore actually reduces the demand for new energy vehicles. It undermines the transition to the green economy. And worse than that, the carbon tax goes into a general fiscus with no loop back to the greening of the automotive industry in any way or form. Hence the comments. Going back to the economic argument, obviously we would agree with all of the comments around externalities and creating pricing differentials to advantage new energy vehicles. The problem is our taxes don't do that.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I don't have significant further comments to that. I've just caught one of the comments around the 15 to 20 year time frame of upgrading oil refineries for getting cleaner fuels. And of course, yeah, just to say, I mean, you know, the way that the green transition has been approached in all countries is to have long-term planning. I mean, the Green New Deal, for example, in Europe, has targets for 2050. So it's that kind of long-term planning and multifaceted interventions that are required to make this this green transition possible. Thanks, Mbofi.
Thanks, Mbongeni. Masibulele?
Yes, I've responded to one or two comments or questions, but essentially what is important about the argument we are making is the fact that the expanded public works program is actually exploited, particularly in the city. We essentially have an ability to get people on training programs without necessarily giving them work, and an ability to inject funding. We piloted such projects a few years ago, before COVID actually, with adult education and training, where participants were paid to go sit in a desk and get adult education and training related schooling. And it was very successful. With SMMEs, we actually have now working on a process where we'll be able to inject funding into SMMEs via the expanded public works program on an incentive basis, without interfering with their day-to-day entrepreneurial activities. In fact, the plan is to just have an assessment, a diagnostic of the participant and their business idea or actual business, and then develop a training program for that we will use for 36 months, without ensuring that we develop this specific training program for each individual based on the diagnostic. And then at the end, we assess how they're doing and decide how much of the available funding we actually inject into the participant, and by extension into their businesses. We have actually piloted an ability to, for instance, create what we call an addendum to a contract of EPLP participants in our skills program, where we say, as part of you being part or taking part in this particular skilling development program, you will are required to attend these 3 or 4 training interventions and actually do well in them. So sort of like a pseudo bursary scheme or scholarship scheme within the city of Cape Town. And we firmly believe that this would work for SMMEs, where the money will then be an incentive on top of us taking them through a training skilling intervention that is specific to their needs and the needs of their businesses. Thank you.
Thanks, Masibulele. I think on that note, we can close out the session. Kindly, if just check the Q&A if there's still any relevant questions that you might want to answer there. But thank you to all the colleagues who presented today, very informative discussions. And I think it's a good introduction into the next session, which will be in 5 minutes on COVID-19 and the just transition. I'll give the round of applause on everybody's behalf. Yes, thank you, colleagues. The presentations and papers will be available online, and the presenters' contact details are also available there. So you can take up any further discussions with them directly, or just to share more resources amongst each other as researchers and policymakers. With that said, I think we can officially close this session. Your 5-minute comfort break before we dive right into the next session at 11:30. Thank you, colleagues. We'll be back right now.